All right, so this is part 2 of our little review video series. So earlier we talked about a fraction. We looked at multiplication with repeated addition. So this will remind you about whole numbers. So this is very similar to whole numbers, right? So for example, we learned 2 different ways to multiply. We can look at multiplication as repeated addition. So in 3rd grade, you did something like this where you had a pictorial model. You had 3 groups, and in each group had 4 stars. So, and then you guys would count 4 plus 4 plus 4 equals 12, right? And then you learned how to make those into separate groups. You learn that this means 3 groups of 4. That's how you described it, where there's 12 stars all together. And then we talked about, okay, well, now how does that look like with fractions? So for example, I now have 4 whole groups, but instead of having whole numbers for my each, I actually have a part of a whole. So within every group, in each group, I have 1/2. And when I combine them all together, I get 2 wholes. Now, we can also look at multiplication as an array. So what is an array? An array is basically a number of objects or pictures that are arranged in rows and columns. Okay, so this is the other way we looked at multiplication when we were in 3rd grade. And so you learned how to make an array where you had a 4x3 array. So you had 4 stars in each row, and you are in each column, and then you had 3 rows. And you got the same answer, it was just represented a different way. So how does that relate to fractions? How do we look at multiplying fractions with an array? So we actually call this type of multiplication a part of a whole. So for example, if I have 1/2 times 4, the numerator, I spelled that wrong. It should be numerator, it should be numerator, shows me the shaded groups used. The denominator tells me the number of groups, and the whole number represents the objects or the number of objects. So for example, if I look at the 4, I'm going to draw 4 stars. Okay. The denominator is 2. So that means I'm going to create my 4 objects and put them into 2 columns. My numerator is going to show me how much I'm going to actually use. So if my numerator is 1, I'm only going to use 1 of the 2 groups. Okay. For example, if I have 1, I'm only using 1 of the 2 groups, one of the 2 in my array, then when I circle it, I notice I only have 2 stars. So my answer is 2. So notice you should kind of make a connection that 4 times 1/2 equals 2, whereas 1/2 times 4 equals the same answer. But in this math STAR test, specifically for the state of Texas, you need to understand the concept of that part of a whole. And the pictures may look very different, but you need to be able to represent them and identify them, regardless of whether you get the right answer. So the product is going to be the same. It's how it's represented, and what it means differently. So that can be kind of confusing. All right. So let me show you an example. So for example, Sammy shared 3/7 of her 28 Thin Mints. So the 28 represents my objects. I have 28 objects. My denominator is 7. That means I'm going to create 7 columns. The 3 out of the 7 tells me how many of the groups I'm going to actually use. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw that I'm only going to use 3 out of the 7. Okay, so my answer, if I have 3 out of 7, I'm going to count how many number of objects. So I'm going to use my array again to find my product. I have 3 going through my columns, and I have 4 going through my rows. So I have 12 Thin Mints. Okay. Here's a mistake that I find is that somebody will look at this and they're going to write 12 out of 28, which is not the answer. Okay, and they'll give you that on the STAR test. So it's very important that you can see multiplication as a repeated addition as in an array. And so for in this situation, your product is going to be a whole number because we're dealing with whole cookies, not like a part of the entire whole, right? There isn't one whole that's made out of 28 parts, and I'm only using 12 out of the 28, right? Here's another example. I have 12 sprinkles, so I have 12 objects. My array my columns are put into 6 columns, and I'm only going to use 1 out of the 6 columns. So I'm actually going to circle the 1 out of the 6. So how many donuts are chocolate sprinkled? 2. Not 2 12ths. We don't want to do this. That's not what they're asking for, right? We're not going to get one donut. Not one donut doesn't have 2 12ths of a sprinkle on one donut. We're looking at how many whole donuts are sprinkled with chocolate. So looking at that question is really important. Do I understand whether it's going to be a whole number or fraction? Which one makes the most sense? So here, now you're going to look at it the opposite way. Like let's say I have a pictorial model and they're asking me to find the number, to find the equation or the expression that represents that array. So in this situation, I'm going to first count how many objects I have, or dinosaurs. So for example, I'm going to use my array to figure out the number of objects. My array is going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 1, 2, 3. So that means 3 times 5 is 15. So I'm going to write 15. It's only using one of the groups. So this would be, and I could do this in a couple different ways. I could say this is 1. Notice that it's going horizontal. It's using the rows instead of the columns. So I'm only using 1/3 of the 15. Okay, so it's actually using the number of shaded groups is going through the rows. So I'm actually going to use the rows to decide the number in the denominator. And since only one of it's circled, 1 is going to be in the numerator and there's going to be 3 in the denominator. So I'm trying to give you as many different examples as you can see. So in your Google Classroom, just to check for your understanding, what I would like you to do is look at the following example. The model below represents 10 times 3/5. What is the product of this equation? Okay, so it's a different way of looking at an array, right? You kind of have to see the 5 groups, or I'm sorry, to see the number of groups, okay? But you still have 10 holes. It's just 10 holes written as rectangles, okay? So you're going to post your answer on Google Classroom on the comment section. Next, which question explores multiplication as a repeated addition, and which question explores multiplication as part of a whole, as an array? And then you're going to post the answer for both on your Google Classroom.